So today we have Dean Knox here from Wharton School from University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much again for taking this time to talk to us, Dean. So before we dive a little bit into your research on the role of officer race and gender in police-civilian interactions in Chicago, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your background, maybe your research and your interests?
Sure. Yeah, I'm trained as an engineer. I am a computational social scientist now at the Wharton School. And so what that means is we just apply computational techniques, modeling, really just statistics, essentially, and data science to the study of human behavior. So I guess my research falls into really two strands. The first is, how do we use data that's incomplete, that's imperfect, to study human behavior? And so we often know about issues like if you don't observe and measure and correct for a confounder, like a confounding variable, that can lead your inferences astray. But there's all kinds of other things that we know, like when you have mismeasurement of key variables, or if you assign somebody to in a medical trial to take a drug and then they don't comply with that instruction. There are all these kinds of research complications that arise really in almost every study, every applied study that you can imagine. And so the question is, how do we address those limitations? And so we do that in a number of ways. And that's kind of the second strand, is how do we use clever sources of new data, things like the shift assignments in Chicago that I'll talk about in a second. How do we use audiovisual data, like recordings of speech? How do we use mobile location data or these new sources that are increasingly coming online to address some of those research design issues that arise from imperfect measurement?
Perfect. So could you maybe talk a little bit about what led you to do this research, and then maybe walk us through your capsule and some of your data and key findings?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, we all know there's been a tremendous amount of attention to policing, and specifically racial bias and racial disparities in policing. The issue, unfortunately, is that the literature on this is really just not very good. So traditionally, people have gone to police departments and they say, give us your data, and the police department will provide them all the stops that were made, for example, or all the times that they arrested somebody or used force against somebody. And then people will do some sort of regression on this and then report the results. And so the problem is that there's so much data that people don't see in policing, right? So you see all the times where an officer decided to initiate the stop, but you don't see all the times where they use their discretion to not initiate the stop. So if you think about somebody who's jaywalking, right? So an officer could actually formally detain them and fill out the paperwork and fine them for potentially, or they could just sort of shoo them along and say, don't do that next time. And then if that happens, and that's something that's a discretionary decision that often can be determined by the civilian's race. It's a discriminatory stop. If that happens, that means people are vanishing, encounters are vanishing out of your data set at these differential rates, and that can really corrupt the conclusions that we can draw. So that was our starting point, and so we engaged with a lot of research in this area. It led to a pretty prominent retraction of a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So basically, we were trying to bring increased rigor to the study of policing, and then we thought, how would we do this better? And so this paper and this capsule are really the end product of that.
Oh, that does sound interesting. So how exactly did you take the data? You mentioned that half of the time people are just left, and half of the time people are actually they're penalized for example, jaywalking. So what kind of data did you use?
Right. So the issue is that we're never going to be able to observe all of the police-civilian interactions, right? The full universe. If you think about what's the data we want to have? Well, we want to have a data set in which every row is every time an officer sees a civilian, and then what are they doing? What action did the officer take? And that's just not something that we're ever going to get to. And so the question that we asked is, how can we best approximate this? Or at least how can we get to some sort of data set that we can analyze where we're not worried about this data going missing at a differential rate? And so what we were able to do is we were able to obtain shift assignments from the Chicago Police Department. And so what that data helps us do is if you and I are just assigned to the same beat, right, the same few city blocks, and we're all working on a Thursday morning or Friday morning, then what we don't know what kind of civilian behavior you and I are seeing. But what we do know is that on average, what you're seeing and what I'm seeing are exactly the same. And so what that allows us to do is then compare not, out of all the civilian interactions, what decisions did the officer make, but instead compare what decisions did you as an officer make compared to the decisions that I as an officer make. And so to the extent that you're doing something different from me, or I'm doing something different from you, we can't both be doing the right thing, if that makes sense. And so what we do is we use this to compare Black and white and Hispanic officers and male and female officers who are working in the same places and same times. And we see these enormous differences in how they exercise the discretion in law enforcement. And so that's the question that people are very interested in when you think about concrete policy remedies. So most officers are white and male just for historical reasons. And they're policing areas that are primarily minority communities. And so you have this mismatch between the officers and the civilians that they're enforcing the law on. And so people have long speculated that if you have officers that look more like the people they serve, then that leads to greater empathy. It leads to fewer excessive uses of force and all kinds of things. And we haven't had good evidence for that, for precisely the issues that I was talking about before. But by working at the shift level, we're able to compare, say, a Black officer and a white officer, again, confronting exactly the same civilian behavior, and then look at how their decisions vary.
Yeah, that does sound very interesting. So when you were doing your research or writing your paper, did you come across like a wow moment? Did you have an interesting find that you thought people should know, something that is not expected?
Yeah, I think the wow moment was really that the differences were so enormous. So if you think about, a typical officer in Chicago will go out, and over the course of 100 shifts, they'll make 50 official stops, like formal detainment of the civilian where they're filling out the forms. And when you compare Black and white officers working in the same place at the same times, on average, the minority officers are making 15 fewer stops. So this is a 30% reduction in terms of the enforcement volume, which is massive. Most of that is because they're making fewer stops of minority civilians. They're making fewer stops for really minor offenses. There's like 50% reduction in arrests for loitering, which is an incredibly subjective category. And so if you think about how officers are exercising this discretion, it looks like white officers, the traditional model of an officer, the traditional demographic group of officers, they're using that discretion to make a lot more stops of minority civilians for really minor offenses. And that's precisely the kind of behavior we're concerned about. So if we're thinking about, would a diversification hiring initiative to hire in more minority officers, would that work? Well, the evidence looks like, if you look at the officers that we currently have, it looks consistent with that narrative. And we see the same thing. We see 20 or 30% reductions in arrests of civilians and uses of force against civilians. And so these are just, the magnitude of these effects is just staggering. If you think about the potential scale of civilians who are being subject to this discretionary, unnecessary enforcement.
So you feel like if there's more diversity in the force, there would be the reduction, as you said, the 30%, there would be like a massive decrease or increase? Like how would that?
So that's contingent on a lot of things. So we do have to be really careful in interpreting, going from a retrospective study to a future policy reform. Right. And so the things that we have to consider are, if we start hiring a lot more people that represent what Chicago looks like today, are we going to get the same kinds of minority officers next year as we had last year? It could be, once you widen the net, you start pulling in people who are more aggressive or less aggressive, or are just somehow different from the ones that we were able to study in our research. It could be that once you start hiring a lot more of those people, you only have a certain number of slots, and so you have to assign them in a different way, and somehow that interacts with what we're talking about. It could be that that there's compounding effects, that once you get enough minority officers in, or really just officers who don't have this like aggressive policing mindset, then the whole culture changes. And so then it would have this really nonlinear effect. And so those are the kind of considerations. I think of them as really second order considerations. But to a first order approximation, it does really seem like, again, at least the minority officers that we currently have in the Chicago PD are just engaging in policing in a very different way. They're exercising that discretion in a way that seems, much more humane.
That's actually a pretty fascinating find. So you specifically looked at the police-civilian interaction in the city of Chicago. I know you mentioned this a little bit in your research, but I wanted to hear about it or hear it in the first hand. So could you give us a little more detail of why you chose this particular city and whether the same assessment could be used to predict such interactions in other cities in the United States?
Right. So the thing that is really cool about this study and the module, I think, is that you can do this anywhere. There is almost no PD in America that does not know when its officers are working.
Right.
It's just like you have to know where your people are. And so if you have that, which almost everybody does, and you have your enforcement records, it's a really simple thing. It's kind of almost surprising that people haven't done this in the past, but you combine those things and we have the code that shows you how, and you could do the same analysis. And you don't have to compare Black and Hispanic and white officers. You don't have to compare male and female officers. You could compare like Officer Vaishnavi to everybody else on the force. Say, are you policing in an outlying way? So that's something that's called early intervention or early warning systems. You want to find the bad apples, the people that are doing something wildly out of line with what their peers are doing. Right. And then we can intervene. And so that's really the same analysis. It's just slicing up the officers in a different way. So it's really cool to be able to put the capsule out there and just have everybody see it. We're pursuing the same data we have already for a number of other jurisdictions. We have this kind of data. Some of that is academic research. Some of it's collaborative with the department. Some of it's open records requests, like in Chicago. We're working with the ACLU. We're working with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division in active investigations of police departments. So some of it's non-academic. It's really policy-related work. I think this is just the start.
So you're saying that at a point we can even extend this particular analysis or this experiment to more than just being a diversity, more like even looking at a person individually in the force than just like what race that person is from. That is actually
exactly
interesting, and I think it would be great in the future just for building the force itself. So my next question is, so many research, as we know, like so many research articles and research papers are generally reproduced. How do you think and others in your fields can use or interpret these results for their further analysis?
Yeah, I think these results specifically or
the capsule, I mean, as you did mention the capsule, but like, could you go like your results and maybe like the data itself?
Yeah, so we collected this data. It's officers every time they make a stop, an arrest, a use of force, every shift that they go out to work on. And so we've already had people just download that data from the capsule to run their own analyses. And so we have some description of what the variable names are, and in our code, it's commented, and you can see how we analyze those things and how we pre-process those variables. And I think that's helpful. I think it's pretty straightforward to extend. We've taken the same code and used it for subsequent analyses in Chicago. You just copy the capsule or export it, and everything's ready to go. There's no question about whether it will run. I think a dirty secret in social science research is most research is not reproducible, and I think people get so hung up on replicating. Can I get the same results in a different context, a different sample, a different study, a slightly different treatment? And we sort of lose focus of the fact that most results don't even reproduce. If you download somebody's code, to the extent that they provide it at all, if you're able to get their data, the code doesn't run on the data. You get an error on line one. Like key variable is missing, or like sometimes it's really innocent. It's just you're on a different platform, a different operating system. You have a different version of some package, and so even being able to remove that initial obstacle I think is something that's huge for the advancement of science.
think
I think there's a transparency thing too. I think it's increasingly I see really rigorous researchers they're just not afraid to air out, have all the code out there for people to see. Just like take my code, take my data, it runs clean, modify it however you want. There's nothing to hide here. You can be confident that the results that I'm reporting are exactly what's produced in this capsule. And so I think that's a fantastic thing for science.
Right. I think that kind of really just answered my next question. So I mean, it's very interesting, because as a computational biologist, like the major thing that I face is like reproducibility issues. Like sometimes when I run something and then I have my colleague or my friend run the same thing and they're like, oh, it doesn't work. It doesn't work on my R package. It doesn't work on my computer. I don't have the memory. So what are the major challenges that you face in your field, if not reproducibility?
Yeah, so I think the system limitations are exactly right. It's just so many little things like setting seeds and like using the right versions of packages. And so I'll say, as part of my work, I develop methods. I'm a methodologist, and so I develop methods, which means software and functions and things that other people can use to run similar analyses. And so much of the time of a methodologist is spent helping people debug why my code isn't running on your machine. And so Code Ocean essentially just frees up all of that time because I can say, well, it runs just fine on Code Ocean. So, maybe you need to make sure your package versions are fine. Basically, it's not an error in the code. We can rule out the possibility that it's an error in my code, at least some like fundamental error. And then everything else is just sort of tracking down the smaller issues. The fact that you can export and create a Docker module, right, means that even if your system isn't exactly my system, we can create a clone of my system in your system, and then you can run it there. So that's like, we always have that fallback option, which is fantastic.
It's actually really great to hear. I guess like that's one thing that really did attract me to the company too. I'm being a little more biased here. Because like, I mean, yeah, definitely like you're able to like create everything and then you can just transport, you can just share it with people and then everyone can just do it. Like I have my colleagues who help me write when I write my code and I'm stuck on something. I have my colleagues, I just have to be like, hey, I'm sharing my capsule with you. Would you just help me figure out what's my mistake and can you help me debug my code?
Oh, that's great. That's a great way to use it, like collaborative coding. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's like this great aspect of Code Ocean that I really love. So is this like, I mean, that's again my next question, like what did you find the most, what did you love the most about Code Ocean? Like something that you would recommend? I mean, because in our previous interview with Sean Westwood, he said that you exposed Code Ocean to him and he asked us to interview you. It's a great way because we get to talk to more people not in the field of computational biology, but in like how capsules and how Code Ocean as a platform is helpful for in other fields too. So what's your insight about Code Ocean?
Yeah, I mean, Sean is a fantastic example of like the ideal user. He's such a careful coder. His code is just like beautiful to look at. It runs, it's very logically oriented. But I think for people who don't come from that background or don't have that experience, the way that Code Ocean is set up forces you to linearize your workflow. It's like you have to run this pre-processing script before the next thing runs, the analysis script runs, and then you have the code that makes your figures. And when you look at people's replication packages, it's like a mess. It's like it's not clear what runs where, and it's just like people jumping back and forth in dirty workspaces. And so that I think leads to a lot of the reproducibility issues that you talk about. So having that, it does impose a little structure that I think maybe people aren't used to. Some users aren't used to at first, but that's something that really improves reproducibility. I really love the fact that it's just like a Linux system on the back end. So I've done analyses where I have to use Python, I have to use TensorFlow to do some modeling step, and then jump out to R to do some analysis, and that's just seamless. It's just totally easy to do.